Jack the Ripper, the mysterious serial killer whose identity has long remained a mystery.
That is.
Until now.
Yeah. DNA from a shawl recovered at the scene of one of his crimes has incredibly found a 100% match.
For more than a century, Jack the Ripper was nothing but a nightmare with no identity. Suspects came and went, evidence gathered dust, and London kept its secret. Now, after 138 years, a name has surfaced from long-ignored clues, changing how history looks at the crimes. So who was Jack the Ripper? Join us as we delve into the details of this horror story, a bloody mystery. Late in the year 1888, something terrible began to happen in the crowded district of Whitechapel, in the East End of London. For a long time before this, people who lived in rich parts of London had heard rumors about Whitechapel. They knew it was full of narrow streets, dark alleys, and people struggling to survive. Families lived in tiny rooms. Many slept 2 or 3 in one bed, and work was hard to find. Poverty was everywhere. Violence, theft, and disease were common. Many women turned to selling their bodies because they did not have any other way to make money. On the morning of August 31st, 1888, something happened that would shock all of England and eventually the world. A local worker named Charles Cross was walking to work before dawn. He saw a bundle in a dark gateway on a street called Bucks Row. At first, he thought it was cloth or something someone had thrown away. But as he got closer, he saw it was a woman. She was lifeless. Her name was Mary Ann Polly Nichols. Her throat had been cut badly, and her body had been hurt in other ways. The sight of her corpse sent fear rippling through Whitechapel. That killing was not the only one. Over the next 2 months, several more women were found deceased in similar ways. On September 8, Annie Chapman was discovered in a yard at Hanbury Street. She had deep cuts to her neck and wounds on her body. On September 30, 2 women were found on the same night, just minutes apart. Elizabeth Stride in a yard off Berner Street and Catherine Eddowes in Meter Square. Finally, on November 9, Mary Jane Kelly was found inside a small room at 13 Miller's Court. Her body had been horrifically mutilated. All 5 of these deaths were linked in a way that sent shock through London. The women's throats had all been cut, and in most cases, the killer had also mutilated their bodies. These acts were not just ordinary. They showed a kind of violence and precision that made people think the perpetrator knew enough about the human body to do more than simply end a life. Some experts at the time thought the killer might have experience in cutting meat, or even some basic medical knowledge. Because these murders happened close together in time and space, and because the attacker did not get caught, the police and the public began to speak of them as the work of one person. However, at the time, there were no modern scientific methods to help identify someone. There were no fingerprints used in investigations, no DNA, no fast ways to connect clues. Police had to depend on eyewitnesses and simple observations, often under poor light, on unfamiliar streets, and with terrified residents. Even when people saw suspicious or strange figures, it was hard for officers to follow up and make a solid connection. In the press, newspapers did not just report these crimes, they sensationalized them. Journalists printed bold headlines and dramatic descriptions of each crime scene. They wanted more readers, and fear sells. This kind of reporting made the killer feel even more powerful. Many people in London felt unsafe walking the streets at night. Even during the day, mothers kept their children close. The city was normally bustling, full of sounds and movement, but in Whitechapel, after each murder, there were long spells where people were afraid to leave their homes. During this time, police started to receive a strange mix of letters. Some were from people claiming they knew who the perpetrator was. Others went further, claiming to be written by the killer himself. One letter became especially famous. It was signed Jack the Ripper. Whether it was genuine or just a cruel hoax, the name caught everyone's attention. Newspapers printed it again and again. Suddenly, the killer had a name, even if no one knew if it was real. The name Jack the Ripper spread quickly across London and then around the world. But despite all the attention, despite hundreds of police interviews and thousands of questions asked, nobody was arrested or detained. Detectives worked night and day. They asked witnesses to look at sketches of suspicious men. They tried to link footprints, bloodstains, and conversations. They questioned known criminals and people with violent histories, yet no firm evidence surfaced that could be used to charge someone. The police force at that time was not the highly trained modern unit we imagine today. The detective branch had been in existence for less than 50 years. Many officers were still learning systematic ways to solve crime. Without fast communication, without scientific tools, and with a flood of false leads, the investigation grew confusing. Locals grew frustrated, even angry. Some marched to the police station demanding answers, while others whispered that the police simply did not know what they were doing. Meanwhile, life in Whitechapel continued. Behind closed doors, families tried to go about their everyday chores. But outside, in the narrow streets where lantern light barely reached, people feared that the next horror could happen at any hour. When the killing spree finally stopped as suddenly as it began, people were baffled. However, years later, police files would call these crimes the Whitechapel murders, and historians would refer to the 5 linked killings as the canonical 5, the core tragedies that define the legend of Jack the Ripper. But that was far from the end. A suspect, hidden in plain sight. In the long, cold mystery of Jack the Ripper, a strange piece of cloth has taken center stage in a new chapter. This cloth is said to be a blood and semen-stained shawl that was found near one of the Ripper's victims more than a century ago. A man named Russell Edwards bought the shawl at auction in 2007 because he believed it might hold secrets from the night of the murder. It was this item that later became the basis of a bold claim, that modern DNA science had finally identified the killer. The shawl is said to have been found near the body of Catherine Eddowes, one of the 5 women murdered in 1888 in London's Whitechapel district. In the original police records from the time, no shawl is listed among evidence taken from the scene, but family stories said a police officer picked it up and gave it to his wife as a gift. Whether this story was true or not would be questioned for years. In the early 2010s, Edwards contacted a scientist, Dr. Jari Louhelainen, a molecular biologist. Louhelainen and his team tested the fabric using new methods that could try to pull old DNA from very damaged and tiny remains. According to Edwards, the tests found blood that came from Eddowes and another set of DNA from semen on the shawl. What was most important to Edwards was that the second DNA sample matched a modern descendant of Aaron Kosminski, a man who had been a suspect in the original Jack the Ripper investigation. Kosminski was a Polish immigrant who lived in the East End of London around the time of the killings. He worked as a barber and had attracted police attention in 1888. Historically, detectives had once focused on him as a suspect, but they never had proof, and he was never charged. Years later, he was institutionalized for mental illness and passed away in a hospital in 1919. Edwards and Louhelainen used a type of DNA called mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, to compare the material on the shawl to that of living people. Mitochondrial DNA is passed down only through the mother, so it is not as unique as other types of DNA, but it can still show familial links. In this case, samples from a descendant of Catherine Eddowes were compared to DNA from the bloodstains on the shawl, and they matched, making it likely that the blood came from Eddowes herself. Then the team matched DNA from the semen stains to a woman descended from Kosminski's sister. They reported a 100% match for one DNA strand, and a 99.2% match for another. To Edwards and some supporters, this meant that Aaron Kosminski's DNA was on the same piece of fabric as Eddowes' blood, and therefore he must have been with her when her life ended. For them, this was striking evidence pointing to Kosminski as the killer. The story of how the DNA was extracted is remarkable in itself. The scientists used infrared imaging and microscopic analysis to identify the stains. They found dark spots that looked like arterial blood spray. Consistent with how Eddowes' body was found with a deep throat cut. Under ultraviolet light, some of the stains showed features that could be semen. From these ancient and damaged sections of fabric, Louhelainen was able to retrieve tiny fragments of genetic material. The matching process was even more unusual. Because Aaron Kosminski had no children, there was no direct line of descent to compare with. Instead, researchers found a female relative from his sister's line. By testing her mitochondrial DNA and comparing it to the shawl's samples, the scientists believed they had found a genetic connection that tied Kosminski to the evidence. The claim that Kosminski is the man behind the Ripper crimes made major headlines in the news, with some outlets reporting that DNA had finally solved the mystery after more than a century. Some articles even described the results as undisputed, and that stirred excitement among those who had waited decades for a breakthrough. But not everyone agreed with how the tests were done or what they meant. Scientists argued that mitochondrial DNA cannot uniquely identify a single person, because many unrelated people can share the same mtDNA profile. Another major issue was whether the shawl itself was really part of the 1888 crime scene. Some experts said the item might not even have belonged to Eddowes, noting that the official list of her personal belongings did not mention a shawl. In addition, the fabric could have been contaminated over years and decades, passing through many hands before scientists tested it. This raised serious questions about whether the DNA truly came from the crime itself or was simply from later contact. These doubts did not stop media outlets from calling the finding a revelation. In some places, headlines declared that the killer's identity had been revealed after decades, and mentioned Kosminski by name as a Polish barber who had once lived in the streets where the murders happened. But even as excitement spread, deeper questions lingered about the truth of the shawl's origins, the limits of old DNA, and whether a match on ancient cloth could ever truly name a killer. And in the shadows of that debate, one chilling question remains. Could the answer be closer than anyone expected? The legend of Aaron Kosminski. One of the most talked about names in the long story of Jack the Ripper is Aaron Kosminski. He was not just a newcomer to Ripper discussions. For more than 100 years, investigators, historians, and crime experts have looked at his life and actions because he fits many details that police at the time thought were important. Many old records, including police notes and handwritten reports, show that Kosminski was taken seriously as a suspect by the detectives who worked the case. Aaron Kosminski was born on September 11, 1865, in Kłodawa, Poland, which was then part of the Russian Empire. He was Jewish, and like many Jewish families in that era, his family left Poland to escape violent attacks against Jewish communities known as pogroms. His family came to England in the early 1880s and settled in London's overcrowded East End, in or near Whitechapel, where many immigrants lived. In London, Kosminski worked as a hairdresser. This work meant he stayed in the local area, cutting and grooming hair for people who came to his shop. Whitechapel was full of small businesses like this at the time. Tailors, butchers, cobblers, barbers, all very close to the dark alleys and busy streets where Jack the Ripper struck. In 1894, a senior police official named Sir Melville Macnaghten wrote a secret report about the Ripper investigation. In that report, he named 3 men he thought were the most likely suspects. One of those men was Kosminski. Macnaghten said this man had lived in the Whitechapel area at the time of the crimes and might have had the dangerous tendencies needed to commit them. Another police officer involved in the original investigation was Sir Robert Anderson, who worked as Assistant Commissioner for the London Metropolitan Police. In his later memoirs, Anderson hinted that the police had identified a suspect in the Ripper case, saying that someone had unhesitatingly identified the suspect the instant he was confronted with him. The suspect, according to Anderson, was a Polish Jew, which matched the description of Kosminski in Macnaghten's files. The name Kosminski in early police papers did not include a first name. It was only much later, decades after the murders, that researchers connected this suspect to Aaron Kosminski because he was the only man with that last name fitting the description in London police records from that time. Life for Kosminski was not easy. By 1890, reports showed that his behavior was troubling. He acted strangely and was admitted to local workhouses, institutions that housed poor and mentally unstable people, several times. In 1891, he was certified as insane and officially sent to Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum, one of the largest mental hospitals in England at the time. Medical records from his time in the asylum show that Kosminski suffered from severe mental illness. He heard voices and had paranoid delusions. He often refused food unless it was prepared in a specific way and avoided washing or basic care. One report described him as eating pieces of bread from the gutter and drinking water straight from taps rather than eating proper meals. These behaviors showed a serious break from normal thinking and routine. Kosminski was later moved to Leavesden Asylum in 1894, where he spent the remaining years of his life. He passed away there on March 24, 1919. That means he lived for another 28 years after the Whitechapel murders had stopped and long after police attention on his name had faded. His time in mental hospitals shaped much of how history views him. In the asylums, doctors recorded that Kosminski was indolent, apathetic, morose, and often incoherent. He sometimes threatened people inside the institutions, including once grabbing a chair at an attendant and another time threatening his own sister with a knife. However, official records noted that he was not classed as dangerous to others at the asylum, which challenges the idea that he would have committed the brutal Ripper murders. Another strange detail from police history involves a witness who saw a man attacking a woman in the street just before she was killed. According to surviving notes, the witness recognized this man as Jewish and later refused to testify because the man was also Jewish, and the witness did not want to be responsible for his execution. It is widely believed by many researchers that the person he saw was Aaron Kosminski. though the first name was not recorded in those old police books. Meanwhile, others have pointed out that records about his mental illness and behavior do not show clear evidence of violence toward other people outside of the asylum. He spent years in institutions, far from the streets of Whitechapel, and there are no records of any killings or serious violence from him during that time. This raises the question, even if Kosminski struggled with mental illness, does that mean he could have been the person who butchered women in the streets of London? Because of these mixed pieces of evidence, Aaron Kosminski has remained one of the most argued over suspects in the Ripper mystery. Yet for all the pages written about police files, witness remarks, hospital records, and old letters, one reality stands out. No definitive proof ever linked Kosminski to the murders at the time they happened. The file with his name was never enough to close the case in 1888, and it was never enough to bring charges against him. Yet, it wasn't enough to wipe away the case. Calls for official inquest. In early 2025, more than 130 years after the crimes in London's East End, a new chapter opened in the long story of Jack the Ripper. This time, the news was not about old fingerprints or police notebooks. It was about people asking for a legal inquest, a proper court-like investigation, to be opened again into one of the murders. This demand came after claims that modern science had given new clues about the killer's identity. The idea of reopening an old case through an inquest is a rare thing. In the United Kingdom, an inquest is not the same as a criminal trial. It is a formal inquiry led by a coroner, an official who examines the facts about a death and tries to understand what happened, how, and sometimes who was responsible. An inquest does not decide guilt or innocence like a criminal court, but it can name a person responsible for a death if the evidence is strong enough. The push for a new inquest in the Jack the Ripper case began with a well-known researcher, Russell Edwards, who has spent years trying to prove that Aaron Kosminski was the killer. Edwards and others believe that DNA evidence from an old piece of cloth, said to be connected to one of the victims, points to Kosminski. But this DNA evidence has not been widely accepted by police or courts. Because of this claimed DNA connection, Edwards and his legal team applied for a new inquest into the demise of victim Catherine Eddowes. Eddowes was one of the 5 women whose murders were linked to Jack the Ripper in 1888. Edwards says that modern testing shows that the DNA on the shawl belongs to both Eddowes and Kosminski's family, and that this information is new evidence that should be examined by an official inquiry. The calls for the inquest have been backed not only by Edwards, but also by descendants of both Eddowes and Kosminski. One of the voices leading this movement is Karen Miller, who is related to Eddowes. Miller has spoken publicly about how the long silence around what happened to her ancestor still affects the families today. She has said that naming the real person responsible, in a legal setting, would be a kind of justice for the victims who never had a trial or real answers. Miller told reporters that the famous name, Jack the Ripper, has become more famous than the actual women who lost their lives. She said that people have forgotten that these women were real people with families. She wants an inquest to legally name the killer, so the historical record reflects the truth, rather than just a terrifying nickname. Support for the idea also came from the descendants of Kosminski. If Kosminski is the person on the DNA evidence, they say, the world deserves to know the historical facts. However, the process of getting an inquest is not simple. In the United Kingdom, reopening an inquest into a death that happened long ago requires special approval from the Attorney General, a top legal official. 2 years before, an earlier attempt to reopen the Jack the Ripper case was refused by the Attorney General. Officials said there was not enough new evidence then to justify a fresh inquest. For the legal application to succeed, Edwards and his team must convince the courts that there is new, significant evidence that could change how the case is understood. The DNA connection, if accepted as reliable, might be that evidence. But so far, police authorities have not agreed that this DNA claim is enough to officially identify a killer or reopen formal proceedings. Newspaper reports have noted that the campaign for an inquest has gathered attention from the public and media. People around the world who have followed the mystery for years have watched closely as this legal push grew in early 2025. Some news outlets reported that the families of all 5 known victims are supporting the call for an investigation, saying it would be a step toward giving the victims back their names and stories. At the same time, discussions around the inquest have pushed public interest in old police files and historical documents. Researchers have pointed out the challenge of proving how reliable old evidence is, especially items that may have changed hands many times over the last century. Many historians and scientists have said repeatedly that even if DNA is present, they cannot be sure it was left at the crime scene rather than mixed in later. Despite every legal challenge, every scientific debate, and every historian's question, the families continue to press for what they see as justice and truth. They say the questions have lingered far too long without formal answers. They believe that modern legal tools, combined with new scientific claims, might finally bring a century-old mystery into the light of day. One key question that hangs in the air is whether the truth could finally be uncovered if history itself could be judged again. Fear versus fame, becoming a media legend. At that very time, England was changing. A law called the Elementary Education Act of 1880 meant almost all children had to go to school. Because of this, more people could read by 1888. Newspaper companies also changed. New tax laws in the 1850s made printing newspapers cheaper. Many newspapers were sold for just a half penny. They could reach many working-class readers who could now read the news for themselves. One of the most popular newspapers was the Illustrated Police News. This paper printed stories about violent crimes with dramatic drawings. It was one of the first tabloids to use shocking pictures and bold headlines to sell papers. During the Ripper murders, it became infamous for its sensational coverage. As the Ripper murders continued, newspapers competed to sell more copies. At the height of the story, over 1 million newspapers were sold every day with coverage of the killings. People all over England and beyond read about the crimes, discuss them with friends, and worried about what might happen next. But this huge coverage came with a price. Many articles were not true. Some newspapers printed wild guesses as facts. Rumors and gossip spread quickly, and stories often changed as they moved from one paper to another. At first, the press and the public looked for someone to blame. Reports appeared about a local man called Leather Apron, a nickname given to a Jewish man who made boots. The newspapers described him in frightening ways. They said he might be the killer, even though the police said there was no evidence against him. He was arrested but soon released when his alibis were confirmed. The police, especially the Criminal Investigation Department, CID, kept many details of their investigation secret. This made journalists even more frustrated. They filled news pages with stories of what they believed was happening. Some reports even stirred up fear and hatred against Jewish and foreign residents in the area, though there was no real proof to support these claims. Into this chaotic story came a letter called the Dear Boss letter. It was sent to a news agency and signed by Jack the Ripper. The name Jack was familiar to the public because of stories about another mysterious figure, Spring-Heeled Jack, who was said to leap over walls and terrorize people. After the letter, the press and the public seized on the name Jack the Ripper, and the idea of a single, nicknamed killer became a media habit. Later murders in other cities were given similar names like the Boston Strangler or the Yorkshire Ripper. Because the murders happened in a very poor part of London, they also drew attention to the terrible living conditions in the East End. Streets were overcrowded, insanitary, and filled with people struggling to survive. The shocking violence of the Ripper murders made many middle and upper-class people notice these problems. Public anger grew, and local groups formed to try to protect the streets. One group, the Mile End Vigilance Committee, organized patrols and tried to help the police. People also offered rewards for information about the killer. But the police struggled with too many tips, false leads, and fake clues sent by people trying to gain attention. As time went on, the murders stopped. But unfortunately, the police never solved the case. The lack of answers and the sensational press coverage made Jack the Ripper a legend rather than just a criminal case. Writers, artists, and later filmmakers used the story to explore fear, violence, and mystery. Over the next decades, Jack the Ripper became more than a news story. In the 1960s, he was often pictured as a well-dressed gentleman with a top hat, not just a street killer. Writers merged his image with other horror symbols, turning him into a part of global popular culture. Books, movies, plays, and games featuring Jack the Ripper have appeared all over the world. More than 100 non-fiction books have been written just about the case, and enthusiasts even study the murders in what they call Ripperology. In modern times, the story of Jack the Ripper continues to draw interest. In 2015, the Jack the Ripper Museum opened in East London. It recreated the streets and scenes of the murders. But many people protested. They said it seemed to turn the deaths of real women into entertainment and ignored the real history of working-class life in the East End. Still, the legend remains powerful, and thousands of visitors walk the same streets where the murders happened over a century ago. What are your thoughts on this horrific criminal case? Could it be that Jack the Ripper was a distraction from the real culprit? Let us know your views in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe to this channel. Before you go, watch the other videos on your screen.